Welcome to Impact Investing, brought to you by the Supporters Fund. From the most multicultural city in the world, Toronto, Canada, I'm your host, Jeffrey J.P. Potvin. And let's please welcome, from the largest exporter of raspberries in the world, Belgrade, Serbia, Keo Sar from Matter Product Studios. Welcome, Keo. It's a real pleasure having you join us today.
Thanks, JP. It's my pleasure to be here and really great to reconnect with you.
Likewise, man. I'm pretty excited about the conversation today, and not only because you're all the way in Serbia, which I'm a big fan of. I did enjoy traveling through Serbia, but because we got to connect on the other side of the world, and of course, all the great things that you've done. But I was so excited about your background because it's almost like you were meant to just be a rock star, because all of the things you've got to be part of has been pretty exciting from an operational standpoint. And you've got to be part of some really cool exits and some great businesses. So I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot today from our conversation, me included. So I'm pretty excited to dive in. So the way we like to jump into our show is we want to give you kind of a quick overview of where you've come from, all the great things you've done from your days in San Francisco, all the way through all the companies that you've participated in. And of course, one thing about you that nobody would know.
Mm. All right. Well, again, thanks for having me. Yeah, like I said, like you mentioned, it's been a long time since we connected, and I remember from the first time we met, it was just a vibe, as the cool kids call it these days. So really great to be on the podcast, and hopefully can share some things I've done, and help people learn some things. And I also looking forward to learning some things as well. My but my story really begins in a refugee camp in Thailand. So culturally, my background is Cambodian, which I'm actually going back in a couple of weeks. Actually, on Sunday, I'm flying back to Cambodia to do 2 weeks of work in the ecosystem. So pretty excited about that. And we can chat a little bit about that later on in the podcast. But my story starts in a refugee camp. So my parents, they escaped the genocide and the war that was happening in Cambodia in the mid to late 70s. And you're talking about, because when I bring it up, a lot of people don't know about what happened there. And without getting into too much of the details, there was a genocide that wiped out anywhere from a fourth to a third of the country over a 4.5 year period. One of the consequences of that was people, fleeing the country into Red Cross camps in Thailand. And that's where my parents fled to. My mom escaped first. My dad, because during that time they were also splitting, up families and men and women into different camps. He was actually scheduled to be executed the day that he escaped. The Vietnamese army invaded, rescued, depending on who you ask. But the point is, they came, all hell broke loose at the camp that my dad was at. And that's how he escaped. And somehow, amongst hundreds of thousands of refugees, found my mom in a refugee camp in Thailand, which is where I was born. So that's where my life began. From there, we spent a year in the Philippines in the Bataan province, where there was a refugee processing center. We got sponsored by a family in the U.S., specifically in San Diego, California, where I grew up. So, after we got the sponsorship paperwork, they sent us to this processing center to help us learn the language, get acclimated. And then, yeah, we moved to San Diego after that, where I grew up. I still think it's the best city in the world, weather-wise, all year round on average. A little San Diego plug there. And then from San Diego, moved up to San Francisco to really just expand my wings, but also start university. So my undergrad was in creative writing. A lot of people actually don't know that because I've been working in tech for a very long time. They're like, oh, what? But I've always love reading and writing. I tried to write my first book in second grade. And then after getting my degree in writing, I pursued my master's in finance. And my career started with two Fortune 100 companies. One was one of the largest electronics retailer in the world at the time, Best Buy. From there, I went to one of the largest financial institutions in the world. And quickly found out I'm just not a corporate person. And that's when my startup career really kicked off. First company I was at was a company called Lending Club. I was a senior manager there, managed a team of, at any given point, 150 to 200 people with 10 to 15 direct reports. We IPO'd. This was in the fintech space. After that, I really wanted to get my hands dirty because when I joined Lending Club, we were at a later stage, and the company was at that time probably a year and a half, 2 years away from IPO. And when we did IPO, just as an aside, I was actually at the New York Stock Exchange for that. One of the coolest experiences in my life. Would love to do that again at some point, but I really wanted to get the experience of building something from the ground up. So joined a Series A company, a company called Lenda. We were another fintech focused on mortgage, where I headed sales and operations there. Company eventually got acquired, which led me to a company called Octane, another fintech building marketplace lending platform for power sports, which I did not know anything about when they approached me to come help build out their customer success practice. And I also did not have a customer success background. So the first time I'm meeting, the founders, and they're describing to me what they want me to do, I'm like, you do realize I've never been involved in any sort of customer success, mechanism, practice, you name it. But they're like, but you come highly recommended, so we trust that you'll figure it out. So I took the job. The company was based in New York, so I got to spend a lot of time there, which is great. And grew the team from 3 to 4 to 25 by the time I left. The company is now a unicorn, doing extremely well. And yeah, I hope to go public because I still have equity in the company. And then the Serbia story. So after Octane, I got approached by a company called Shift and building technology for in the moving logistics space. And that's the company that actually moved me to Serbia. And it's been 4.5 years now as chief revenue officer there. We grew revenue enough over 2 year period to raise, I would say, a sizable Series B. And then I left the company to start just working on ecosystem building, doing advisory work, being an angel investor, and getting more involved in the venture and investing side of the ecosystem. And that's what I've been doing the last couple of years until I joined Matter Product Studio. And we do digital transformation for mid-market and enterprise, AI driven, with the goal of as quickly as possible helping them realize ROI on their tech spend. And then that's where we are. That's the journey. Done a lot of different things, and been fortunate enough and really grateful every day for the journey. Some parts of it have been really tough, but it's also kind of shaped the person I am now, and as well as how I view the world and how I approach my care around the things that I do and the thoughtfulness that I put into things.
I love it. It's a fantastic story. And before we unpack some of that, one thing about you that nobody would know.
One thing about me that no one would know. So my first name is actually my last name. So my father, he passed away a little bit over 9 years ago. Before he passed away, I was visiting him in San Diego because I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. He said, I need to tell you something, and I have a request. I was like, okay, yeah, shoot. He said, well, our last names isn't actually Sar. He said, our last name is Keo, and requested that, we all change our last names to our first names. Um, and I was a bit shocked. And then after thinking about, had to tell him, I can't do this. The nightmare I would have to go through to change all the paperwork and the legalese around that. I was like, no, sorry, Dad. This is one request I can't fulfill for you.
And what's the reason that the name swap? What was the reason behind that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because if you go to places like Cambodia, they start with the last name first and then the first name. So my cousins in Cambodia, for example, I went to the wedding at the beginning of June. Their last names are Keo, which is my first name, which is supposed to be my last name. So that's the reason. So I don't know why and how we came up with Sar. So that's still a mystery to me that I need to find out.
So
Yeah. So when they
so the other
yeah, go
people in
ahead.
your family, how are what's their like, just say your
Well,
brother or something, like, what's their name? How do they are they using Sar as their last name?
yeah, everyone is using Sar as their last name. And then the other unique thing about places like Cambodia and even Thailand and I think Laos, more than Thailand, is you say like there's a first part of your name, and then there's a second half of your name. So for example, like my name is Kevin Koth, right? My sister's Kalkodati, my brother's Kalkodam. So like our first part is the same, and then there's a different, call it middle part, if you will.
Okay. So you wouldn't all
Yeah.
end up with the same name if you did what he asked you to do. Would everybody end up with the same?
Well, I mean, our last names would be KEO, and then we'd have to either take that middle part and take that as our first name, or come up with a different name entirely.
That's interesting. Well, either way,
Yeah.
I guess it could have been a fascinating work effort of putting together your new names and IDs. But yeah, it's I guess you kind of
Yeah.
have a short, abbreviated, cool name, so you don't really have to go far. And I guess I can understand you're like, no way, man, I can't change this. This is me. I'm happy with this name,
Yeah.
so it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then I think people would think like I'm some secret agent, or I witness protection or something. Why are you changing your
Fair,
name?
fair. Well, when you go back to your upbringing and the things that you learned about, and you're kind of talking about the refugee camp and how you guys moved from there. I had the opportunity a long time ago.
Mm,
I'm going to say it was 15 plus years ago that I spent some time going through Cambodia, so backpacking through there. So I
mm,
got to learn quite a bit about the people, and of course the background, the culture, and it's pretty fascinating on where and how things have changed since Pol Pot days, and thank God it's
mm,
shifted a lot. If you take kind of that learning, and what I know that you were obviously quite an infant at that time, or just
mm,
coming to be born at that time. So as you kind of started to move through your childhood in these different countries, in the Philippines, and then obviously
mm.
moving to the U.S., I'm sure there was a cultural shift for your parents, and maybe not so much for yourself because you were quite young, and you were going through and growing up in San Diego. Um, you obviously have this strong drive and push to be great at things, and to make sure you put everything into behind everything you do. So you jumped into university. You obviously got through your writing degree, and which is really cool, and you can tell that because I see a lot of the things you write. So you're kind of building this persona, and then you jump in, you do your finance. And I was always curious what drove you into the finance side of the companies that you were getting behind. What was the mechanism that really lured you into it? Was it because you did your MBA in finance, or was it just a keen interest that this was a moving space and that you wanted to be there?
Good question. I'll start with I. I've always been good at math. My dad. It's a funny story. So in elementary school, he would never let me use a calculator. He'd make me do everything longhand, and at that point I didn't really understand it because I'm like, all these other kids are using calculators. Why can't I use calculators? But he wanted me to think through it and problem solve it and write it out by hand, which in retrospect helped me remember it better, like whether they're the formulas or how to solve a problem and how to approach a problem. As an example, I was doing eighth grade math in fourth grade. Like my teacher at the time, Mr. Pesta, he came up to me one time. He's just like, how come you never pay attention to math class? I'm like, I already know all this stuff. Like, I get 100% on every single test. And he's like, oh, I did not connect that. So, from that point forward, he had his teachers aide would teach me higher level math than the rest of the class while they're going through their regular study. So I've always enjoyed it because like one of the things that I'm keen on is being a problem solver, and that's really what math is to me. It's like figuring out how to solve an equation or whatever it is. Um, so that was really my interest in finance, because even in my during my undergrad, I was taking finance and economic classes because those are things that I also enjoy. So it almost made sense to actually do it formally at the grad school level, and then fintech naturally just made sense to me because if I think about you know the levers and the leverages that we have in the world, finance is one of them, right? And finance specifically that solves problems for normal everyday people. So like Lending Club, what was attractive was they built one of the first, if not the first, like marketplace where they allowed individual investors to invest small notes. You're talking about $100, $200 into an asset class that previously was only for institutional investors and banks that had hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to invest. So that was really cool for me. I'm like, oh, I can also take part in this economy and help drive that. And that's always been something that's continued to drive me when I think about being involved, whether it's a company or a project or a partnership. It's like, how does this impact the world and create a more fair and equal world?
I love the idea and that you push around the fair side, and of course uh, the impact that it's going to take on everybody else, so that you're not just going and working for a company that's polluting through chemicals or whatever. You're kind of analyzing and saying, what I jump into today, if what's that going to change if this company is successful, or will it build value for other people? You mentioned a few times throughout our conversations, but through other things I've read too,
Mm,
is that you wanted to build get into and build an economy, like build out a way, a community, like tie that around everything that you worked on. Was that also impactful for you when you were choosing to go into this space? Was it that you could be part of a different community, that you could build into this community? And were you cognizant of that at the time? Or was it more learned as you went through that, hey, there's actually a whole group of people here. There's a whole ecosystem here that's
mm.
being built out, and it's really helping these people. And there's a lot of passionate people doing this. Maybe I can build different economies later, or build into these different communities as I start to grow in my field as well.
Yeah, great question. That is definitely a learned experience and learned exposure. Where when I initially joined these companies, the assessment was around what is the experience that I would get. Obviously, there's like the compensation factor, and then also the learning factor. Like how am I going to be challenged, and what are the opportunities for me to grow within this organization and as a professional. Um, and then as I've gone through this journey, I've become more conscientious of, okay, like what's the impact that this company is making, and how do I get myself involved in that outside of just being an employee and executing my role really well. And what does that look like? How do we best serve the community that we say we're trying to serve? Right. So, for me, and yeah, I don't talk a lot about volunteer activities, but um, that's something I'm always conscientious of. So when I was living in the Bay Area, I would volunteer my weekends to teach at like Cambodian school. I would donate and things, and this is just stuff like I just keep on the download because um, for me it's important, but I didn't feel like the needed to like shout it from the rooftop, so to speak. But yeah, to more specifically answer the question, being able to be involved in building a community was also connected to like my father as well, because he was the president of the Cambodian Buddhist Society in San Diego for a number of years, and being able to watch him, and this is all volunteer work. He helped expand the temple. He helped turn it into a community center where events were hosted. Cambodian school where both adults and kids would come to learn over the weekend. And I just remember, he would make us go to Cambodian school, and I hated it at the time, because I'm like, I'm 10 years old. What do I want to do on the weekends after a whole week of school? I want to wake up and watch cartoons and go play, right? But every Saturday and Sunday morning, we get up dressed in my white shirt and blue or khakis or blue pants, and go to the temple, to Cambodian school. And there's a lot of things I didn't understand at the time, but I'm extremely appreciative of that experience now, because like I speak the language, I would say, better than most people who grew up in the U.S., and I can also read and write it, and those things wouldn't have happened without that experience of my dad effectively forcing me to go to school. But it also made me very conscientious of the impact that we can have on communities, even if we just think we're one person. Because he was one person, but I mean, he made a heck of an impact.
No, I love that. And there's a few pieces there that are impactful to that I grew up learning kind of the same scenario. My father we're Catholic, so same thing,
Mm,
doing a lot of events with the churches on weekends. My father was Knights of Columbus, so he would bring us to all these events, and we would have to work the gambling halls, and we do all these things. But to your point, it's all about community. So when we would go set up bingo night, it was because you were trying to get people to come out and participate together, or when you were doing a charity event at the school playground for the weekend where it was funs and games. It was all about building that
mm,
community and the impact you make. And to your point, when you were kind of going on your fingers there, what I loved about what you shared there is in engagements, I always share to people that there's three things that you need to get out of every engagement. Who will I meet? What will I learn? And how much money will I make? And I think you just expanded that into a fourth and maybe a fifth is who will benefit from my engagement,
mm,
and what community can I build while I'm here? So if we expand those three things, because they're more about I getting something out of this engagement, those other ones are what am I giving back to this engagement? And I would always tell students this is that when you're looking at something, you have to figure out which is most important to you. And for me, the most
mm,
important was not about making money. That was last. What was most important was what am I going to learn? I just want to learn. That's all I care about. And then secondarily is I have to meet people because I'm terrible at it. So I have to put myself into a scenario where I will meet people because I'm forced to. I'm there and I cannot get away from it. So I'll meet them. So those to me became a really important factor. So it built you up as a person. And it sounds like if you add in these community pieces, you're kind of well rounding yourself into being able to be more objective, to take these experiences
mm,
further by
mm,
learning what other people are going through. Because you may have not had to go through that. No, you experienced what you did as a child, but now, as you've grown and built all of these characteristics, maybe there was you don't have those anymore, but those other people that are around you are going through those, and you can kind of figure out how can I filter that, how can I help them, and now you have some wins that you're going to gain from that. I help the community
yeah,
grow. I help them gain some better value. So it's kind of fascinating how you grow through these things over time.
yeah, absolutely. And I will have to say, I'm really surprised to hear about you being shy about meeting people.
Yeah, it runs
not
through this
not the
noodle.
impression I got, man.
No, it's you become very. I guess I read this podcast, or I read the podcast. I listened to this podcast once, and it was interviewing them. It was a famous person. I don't remember who the person was, and they asked them,
Hmm.
when you're going through this, does it, what do you think about it? And he said, this is the scariest thing in the world for me. And they said, well, why is it so scary?
Mm,
He was, well, I'm an introverted person, and I have to put myself out there, and it's the most stressful
mm,
thing in the world, but it's the best feeling at the end. But
mm,
you metamorphosize yourself every day
hmm.
to be able to be part of something so that everybody else is at a comfort level so they feel comfortable. And it's fascinating that you find the mechanisms that allow you to blend in and
Yeah.
help everybody else feel comfortable, even if it's something that you're not and you're not really at that stage for. So you have to work extra hard at it, but no one will ever
Hmm.
notice because it's not something that you want people to perceive or even to see from you, right? So it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's the concept of doing things that scare you, because that's, that's where the growth is, right?
100%.
And or the there's that other saying, and I'm probably butchering this, is the treasure you seek is in the cave that you don't want to enter.
I like that. That's a good line. Yes.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, I think the fear of everything, we all have fears, but fears hold us back. And because you
Mm,
and I have a lot of similarities, like I'm going to say way more than I've met in other people. And the reason I think that you're a traveler, you have no fear when you
mm,
travel, which is the same, myself as well. And what I find is that once the first time I did it, it was scary, but I did it myself by myself because I didn't want to show. Maybe in your mind you don't want to show weakness, so your weakness would be shown because people could see it on your face, like, oh my god, deer in headlights. So you go and do it yourself. You're like, I'm going to go to the movies by myself. I'm going to go here by myself. And
yeah.
once you've accomplished it once, it's just then it's like this thing's easy. Why didn't I do this all the time? So then you start to
Yeah.
think about it as you travel. You're like, well, I got to challenge myself. So when I go through X-ray scanners at the airport, I'm trying to figure out what things can I get by here that they're not going to catch because I got to challenge myself. This is boring. So you start to challenge everything you're doing. And I think that once you have that
Mm,
mindset,
mm,
there's no fear. There is fear, but it's the cave. You're like, cave, that's nothing. If there's a waterfall,
yeah.
that'll be cool in there. I got to find this thing. So your brain starts to change what the challenge is, even though to everybody else, that cave is a challenge. Your challenge isn't the
Right.
cave anymore. It's something further on that you haven't even come across because your brain has already said that's easy. I can do that, no problem.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And most of the things that I've come across in my life have not been remotely as scary as I thought they were. And then the other thing is, like, you've survived your worst day.
That's true, and there's
Uh,
way more coming. So you
there's way
you
more
can,
coming.
and maybe this is good or bad, but then it's also how do you reflect on it. And this kind of goes back to the next question I had is that when in your
Mm,
business, when you were operating and you were running 150 to 200 people, that's incredible scale on how you are managing teams. And we were talking earlier about talent, and we'll kind of dive into that. But one, how did you manage 150 to 200 people? I think that's a skill set that not a lot of people that I'm aware of have, because typically that's broken down
mm.
into many managers and many people supporting people. But how did you find one, the hiring side to that, and two, managing outcomes that everybody could get behind? Because you become that leader for them. How do you get people to rally and get behind you when you have that many people working for you? And would you have any, say, top two, three things that you would tell people, like, hey, when you're growing teams, focus on these things?
Yeah. Well, the first question in terms of the hiring part, it's being extremely clear on who you think is going to be successful in your program, right? Because you have, as a manager and a leader, I have a very different style than probably you do and many other people, right? So understanding the people that are going to operate well under you, both from a cohesion perspective, but also a healthy disagreement perspective, where you're not going to necessarily agree on everything, but you've built a good enough culture where you can disagree, uh, come to a decision, and move forward together. Because I think that's like hypercritical. And when I interview people for management roles, I, I'll spend less time on the functional aspects of it and more time on their personal views on how they manage and lead, and just how they approach dealing with people. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if I hire a manager or supervisor, I'm asking them to lead another team of 10 to 15 people. And that's how it was, right? Like I had a team of 10 to 15 direct reports. They had a team of 10 to 15 people under them. And I would tend to ask questions like, well, going back to the comment or discussion about things that scare you, that's actually one of the things I would ask people. Like, what are the things that scare you? Like, what are you scared to do? Right. So that's one. Like, two, like, what do you actually want to learn? And then three, I was like, and this was always an interesting question because I got so many different answers. I was like, why are you doing this? Why do you want to do this? Like, how's this personally meaningful for you? And then sometimes I'll throw some like goofball questions, like for example, and this is because we're going to talk about favorite books and movies, I think later on. But I was like, I'll ask someone like, why do you think Forrest Gump isn't or is the best movie in the world? And it's more just like to take down the veil and have some fun during the interview and see how they react. Another question I like to ask sometimes is, what do you think happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force? And it's really just to see how they're thinking about these things and how they approach the answer. Because there isn't really a wrong or right answer, right? It's just like, what's your personal view? Um, and then after that, it's really having clear expectations. So and I'll use Shift as an example. One of the things I'd love to do was do a cultural orientation. So we would hire batches of people, and this, typically you leave this to HR, some other function. I did it myself as a chief revenue officer and like managing a majority of the business. Where I'm like, I get this batch in a room. I've got this deck that I walk them through that outlines my cultural expectation of the team and like how do we need to conduct business, how do we need to interact with each other, what are the expectations from my leadership team including myself, and what's the expectation from the team, right? Because you can talk about metrics and KPIs and all of that things, which is all great and critical to the business, but understanding how you do that and how you act as you do that is also really critical. So that helped with alignment, in a way that I've seen it be successful over and over again. Because I really started this practice at Lending Club. Like, I'd get a team, I'd get assigned a new team to go through this whole like cultural integration, as I call it. And then I just like, oh, this is really works. Like, let me just keep doing that. And it's evolved. And I love doing it. And that's worked really well for me. And then one of the other things I do is try to get silent voices out into the open. And what I mean by that is, we'll be in a room of like supervisors, and typical of any room, there are people who are going to speak more than others. I will purposely call out people who aren't speaking, and more often than not, they're dropping like nuggets of wisdom and um, knowledge and their own experience. Where I'm like, wow, like you need to speak up more. And it also got people comfortable just talking about it and bringing up topics, especially like first time managers.
I like that, and I think there's certainly a lot to unpack there. But I like the fact
Mm,
that um, you create a version of what are these people's expectations, what are they going to get from this role, and then how can I coach you throughout this role
mm,
and time that you're here so that you can integrate and be inclusive or included in all of these pieces that we're working on and bring the most to the game and be the best that you
yeah.
can be. And it sounds like you've kind of broken through all these little barriers to help people better adjust, but also feel like they're part of this team, and instead of just
Mm,
being a number inside of 200 people, they're actually feeling like they're 200 people inside of one. So it's the reverse psychology of it. And I love that you take the approach of what scares you. Why do you do this? Why do you want to be part of this? And you're getting them to articulate it. Maybe you record it and share it with them a year later and say, hey, remember when we were interviewing, you said these things. Are you hitting this? Did you do what you
mm,
said you were going to do? Did this feel part of what you were trying to achieve? I love the idea of the Forrest Gump movie. Hopefully, everybody's watched it. But I do like the quirky side because you're also trying to find out is one, how do they think, and two, are they have some humor into themselves, and do they
Yeah.
can they fight an argument that maybe isn't worth fighting, and is it worth watching and seeing this happen? And I think the last part to it, and I think you talked about this in some other podcasts, was about being very strategic strategy and like what that
Mm-hmm.
strategy
Mm-hmm.
looks like, and do you have a strategy where you're trying to go with that? So if that sets your expectations, that's kind of mirroring into this overall strategy of what are we trying to do here, not as just as a business, but what are you doing as an individual? What are you trying to achieve in this engagement that you have with us today? And
Yep.
now, obviously, the last part I loved is trying to get everybody feeling like they're part of the system, which is that getting people that aren't talking to start talking, and opening themselves up to vulnerability, which is sharing and expressing their opinions
Mm-hmm.
in a management meeting, which is always going to be scary.
Yeah, and and it's one of those things, pushing people in a positive way to get them comfortable doing it, right? Because oftentimes they don't know how this connects to later on, like in their career. Because the last, call it, year or so, I've had a lot of like former direct reports that have reached out to me and said, "Hey, you remember like that thing you taught me? Like I still do a thing. I just got promoted at work." I'm like, "That's freaking amazing. I love it." Yeah, pass it on.
That's exciting. And this kind of lines up to kind of how you are with people, right? You're very
Mm,
calming and easy to work with, and allow people that platform to move forward and grow, which is really exciting. So now when you've taken on this role of CRO, my question is that, because every startup probably wants to be able to have these types of roles, the big title roles that drive the business. Can you share a bit
mm,
more about what a CRO really does? Because to me, when you look at the divide of CEO and CFO, and now you have a CRO, uh, it's all money. All of these are about driving financial value for the company. Is
yeah.
there a should startups start looking at a CRO role and saying our goal is to have this type of role in our company, because we really need to be all about making money and figuring out all the different avenues to do this? And maybe you can share a bit about what that looks like, because in my brain I'm now thinking, man, I got to get everybody to be just like this,
Mm,
because I think this is what's going to
mm.
drive out a value in a company.
Yeah, no, great questions. And I would start with it. It depends, right? I think at some point having a CRO within your organization is critical. But some of the factors that you have to think about is it a product like led growth, or are you dependent on having like a large sales team? What's your go to market, right? Like those things that you have to understand. But I'll go further than that and say at an early stage, especially if you're just launching the company, I very much believe in founder led sales. Like you, as the founder or founders of the company, have to be able to sell the product, talk to your customers on the ground, and be able to get that feedback to build the best, to continue to build the best product and understand how to sell that product. Because when you make your first hire, let's say if it's a chief revenue officer, you have to be able to transfer that wisdom and all the things that you've collected as the founder and say, hey, we've gotten it this far. And I would say, you know, Series A companies are probably like prime to start thinking about a CRO. But ideally, before that, you've got sales processes in place, you've got sales playbook, all these other things in place. And bringing in a CRO is really to take those things away from you as a founder and start juicing the revenue, right? Whether that's like building an official revenue operations, whether that's upscaling your sales team, looking at your technology stack and figuring out which technology to implement to accelerate your sales. So those are the things that I would take into consideration from a chief revenue officer perspective. And then, and I would say it's different at different companies as well, right? So when I was at Shift, I did the strategic and operational part of the revenue, but I was also doing business development as well. And I would say that was probably 10 to 15% of my time because we were often dealing with very large customers, like Google, AARP, Amazon, and these required myself as an executive at the company, especially like the one responsible for revenue, to be in those meetings.
I think that's a great breakout of how and where you should start planning the CRO. And I think you phrased it perfectly by saying it's taking the revenue processes, um, and how you've streamlined the CEO's sales book or playbook into someone else's role and putting that into the CRO role so that the founder can focus on strategy and growth of the business,
Yep.
and allow this new role, this CRO role, to focus on the revenue streams, on scaling the sales team, and all of the facets that would tie into that. I think that is a very smart way of looking at it. And I would think most companies should have a CRO level. And I don't see that as often as it should, because it makes a lot of sense that if you want things to be accountable and responsible, that this CRO level would really make a big difference in
Mm,
a business. And that doesn't fall under the
yeah.
CFO or the CEO any longer. It needs to fall under its own direct reporting side, because the CFO is financially making the whole business sound and cash flows and everything else that's going on
Mm,
inside the business, and the CRO is just heavily focused on
yeah.
what are these levels of revenues that we need to gather, while the CEO can be working on raising money, working on other
Right.
pieces of the business that are crucial, debt, whatever that might be with the CFO. Like you're blending rate roles, but at the end of the day, having one person accountable, I think, makes a big difference to that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a CRO, but someone has to be in charge of taking care of the revenue. Um, and you've invested in companies, you've built companies. Most important thing is to continue to generate revenue, and ideally to grow your revenue over time. And if you're a venture backed business, like you're talking about, you need to figure out how to do this exponentially.
Correct. Exponentially is the key there, especially if you're venture back. To your point, it's difficult to do that with outside. And this kind of generates the last question before we kind of move on to our 60-second spot. And this is when you went IPO. So you kind of have this
Mm,
progression, right? You're moving through, you've become the CRO, you're generating all these types of revenue, and now you're getting into the IPO space. And this is probably every founder's dream, that as they've kind of built companies, work through the slugging along and working through this whole process, and now you get to this spot where you're going to go IPO, and to your point, where you're at the stock exchange and you're excited to launch and kick this off. Um, what were the learnings that you took from making that switch? If we've had a few companies that have gone public over the years,
mm,
and I think it's pretty exciting. But where did you see the big change occur? Was it a couple of years prior when that decision was made? We talked earlier where one of the companies you've been with came to you and said, "Hey, we're going to sell ourselves." And it's a bit of a shock. Everybody's like, "Wait a second, I was loving it here, and what? Now you're going to sell, or now you're going to go IPO? Like, what does that change from my role? And does that mean I got to work more?
yeah.
Does that mean I got to do 10,000 more things? What's in it for me? What do I gain from this?" So, what did you find was that transition from being this private company that you were working hard, loved what you're doing, to now, hey, in 2 years we're going public, and these are the things that are going to change? What were the things that changed, and what would you do differently, or what do you think could be done differently while working through that type of process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. Well, specifically at Lending Club, we started having that discussion, I would say, probably about 18 months before the company actually went public. Um, and you know, when I think about what changed during that time, a lot of it was governance, right? So we got tighter with how we structured the board and making sure we had the right board together. Um, we had to reassess the organization as well. It's like, okay, if we're transitioning from a public company to a private company, do we have the right people in place to manage a public business? Um, Internally, in terms of operations, there was a very long period of just heavy audits, right? Like, taking a, fine tooth comb and really looking at every single thing that we were doing and making sure it was up to standard, to the investment banks that we're talking to that were going to help us go public, right? And the other thing was just around communications, right? There were things that we couldn't say publicly, and it was very clear to us, like, okay, like if this is the path that we're going, these are things that we can disclose. These are things that we can't disclose. And it was also very, tiered by level. If you're at the exec level, you were privy to information that the rest of the company, wasn't. So there's this very careful filtering down process of information, so that nothing could get out. And but the other aspect of it that I also want to make sure that we call out, it was also built a lot of excitement for the company. There were many people who had been in the company for years, and now seeing this, I'm not going to call it the end, because I've seen that too. I'm like, no, this is just a big milestone. Getting to an IPO is just a milestone. You still have a business to run after that. So that's something people have to keep in mind. It's like amazing milestone. Obviously, I know, a lot of companies want to get there, but it's just that it's a milestone. You should celebrate it, but being able to quickly pivot back into like, okay, now that we're a public company, all these things have changed. How do we continue to build a really sound business, that continues to provide for all our stakeholders, and that customers, employees, investors, all of that. Yeah, because after we IPO'd, a lot of the complaints or negative feedback from employees it became more corporate, but that's what we needed to do to be a public company. So there's things that for people to think about, because there is more scrutiny involved, as you're looking to go public.
The interesting part, of course, all of that, the excitement and the build up, the extra work that goes into supporting going public. And of course, you mentioned the big one, which is, you're shifting the people that are operating. A public
Mm-hmm.
company is, as you mentioned, there's a governance perspective. So there's a lot more information being shared, opened up, and
Yep.
you need the right people to support that. And we found that as well, that a lot of them say it's the talent that you have at that point that makes a big difference when you're going public, because public means
Mm-hmm.
that it's public facing. They're being invested by the public now, and the public wants to see that, the CFO has 10 years of public experience, not 10 years of startup experience. It makes a big difference if you're going to try to gain dollars from bankers and institutional investors that are going to come in and invest in your IPO or into your company post
Absolutely.
IPO. So it is fascinating, the shift that you have to go through to go into the policy side and the governance.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one thing that you would say that could have changed or been better if they would have done this at the start? And I'll just preempt that by saying, you mentioned governance and making it more corporate. Do you think there's a time when you
Mm-hmm.
make it more corporate, or do you think you structure that right from the get go? And the reason I say that is, when the bankers were going through and you were like, oh my God, we got to go through this whole change and all this stuff. This is ridiculous. And if you would have done it at the beginning and had all the data correctly managed and all the years of your filings done properly, and you didn't have to go
Yeah.
back and correct and clean up all that stuff, do you think it would have
Mm-hmm.
made the business more palatable at that time and easier to transition to IPO? Or do you think, it all happened at the right time and it didn't matter that, these things were screwed up in the past, we corrected them at the time when we
Mm-hmm.
needed to, instead of trying to do it when we didn't have the money as a startup?
Yeah, that's actually an amazing question. I'll start with, I don't know if the company IPOs, if that were the case. And I say that with the intent of expressing how startups are run, how they're operated, versus more established companies that have this governance and all these rules and regulations and compliance in place, right? Because there's just things that you can't do as a public company, that you can do as a private company, like experimenting with a lot of like the process procedures, and experimenting with the platform, and like with the exposure to, in this case at Lending Club, like the exposure that a investor would get, to certain asset classes, right? And these were things that we could do as private companies, and as a startup, because that's kind of part of the ethos of the startup, is being able to experiment with things to get it right, right? And when you get it right, that's when you start seeing this growth, and that leads to IPO. So I I would say no. I think if we were to try to do that beforehand, I don't think we would have IPO'd. Um, that's my opinion, because it would have blocked a lot of things that we were able to do as a private company.
I love that. It's so true that the autonomy you have as a startup allows you to be aggressive, challenge, and do things completely off the cuff in order to react to get something further ahead and move it forward. And if you had added too much governance into it at the beginning, those things may never have happened, and the company may never even got to the point of being successful enough to even drive an IPO.
Yep. Yeah.
So I'd almost wonder why you
Yeah.
bother even going IPO, because then you go back to that governance side. And has the business got to a point where it's past the scale up? It's obviously scaling, but it's got into the process where it's such a refined cookie cutter process, meaning that every IPO or every
Mm,
company that is on the stock exchange should be in a cookie cutter position where we've isolated sales down to 3 days of conversion, and we can do it in
hmm.
seconds, this, whatever it is. And that's why we're going, because more money, more exposure. We're just cookie cuttering this
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. I think there's a big caveat there too, which is, we were in the financial services space, which is heavily regulated, almost everywhere. Right. So, it's not like we were just building software. And that was, I think, a major consideration in terms of the the preparation and the execution of the IPO as it relates to, becoming more, as we put it, corporate.
Yeah, I love that. That makes sense, and no matter how you approach this, I think it's that last minute decision that creates the energy to get it over the line for
Hmm.
the next time. I think if you plan too much of this, their energy and the processes would just annoy everybody to the point where they wouldn't want to do it, because people do want the randomness of life. And I think when you put
Yeah.
that, hey, I got to get this done, everybody wants that challenge. Oh my God, that's the next
Yeah.
stage. And if you call it the phases, you created that phase. You're like, this is just the next milestone in this business, and we
Yeah.
all have to tackle this today, and we'll be done in 18 months. And I think the energy that people put behind that 18 months would be exciting. And to your final point on this is celebrate the win. Go out and enjoy, or whatever it
Hmm.
is that you do as a
Absolutely.
team. You worked hard, and that's what got you there. It wasn't all the other stuff that you avoided, the things that you blew up and all the things you screwed up. It's all about what you did to get to that IPO. And I think that's exciting. So very cool.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
Exactly. Well, we're going to transition into our 60-second spot. So, the way this
Oh
works,
man.
you have 60 seconds to rant about anything that you want on a topic that is passionate for you, and I will try my best to
Mm.
rebuttal. So, I will set the timer. I know we talked about this, it's never been 60 seconds, but I will turn it over to you when you're ready to go, and you're on.
My rant. Uh, I wish the world would figure out how to communicate better. Um, I mean, it's a really screwed up world right now, and I think a lot of issues can be solved if we actually communicate with each other and be clear and transparent. Um, what I see a lot of right now is there isn't a lot of civil discourse happening. It's typically my view and my view and my view is right, and you're completely wrong. And that is leading to conflicts, whether it's personal conflicts with individuals or larger groups or regional groups. And it's just, quite frankly, at least for me, it's just like really sad to see how the world is operating in that manner. And if you take a step back and think about just communication in general amongst those closest to you, your friends and family, and being able to practice having hard conversations where people aren't taking offense um, at each other and with each other. That doesn't lead to conflict, and conflict is okay, right? One of the things my father taught me early on, among many things, is he said people are typically afraid of conflict, but they shouldn't be. He said, and I was like, tell me more. Like, what people don't like confrontation. But he's like, confrontation and conflict is usually the first step to a resolution, assuming that you're able to talk about it and again, have a dialogue about it and coming to some sort of conclusion, because we don't necessarily need to agree on everything. We shouldn't. Yeah, I don't think that's how the world should operate. But we should be able to have cordial disagreements, is how I would put it, without it escalating into major conflicts and damaging relationships.
I love it. That was a great 60-second spot. So I'm going to unpack this. I'm supposed to be
Mm,
the opposite side of this, but I am never the opposite side. So I don't even know how to rebuttal against anything anybody shares. But in this case, I 100% agree with you. The communication skills need to go all the way back to childhood and taught in school. Now, I think the world, and I'm going to say the world has to come to this problem of trying to understand what is real versus what has been made up by business to sell more product. And it's becoming
mm,
so prevalent that the world has used this communication mechanism to generate value. As an example, one of the things that I was learning about, I was in 2013-15 area. I was fighting for the bees, so against Monsanto, etc. So
mm,
um,
mm,
the number one growing plant group based in the world right now is honey. So
mm,
they came up with this whole strategy to fight for the bees because they were saying that the bees, the pollinators, were all dying off and they were being killed. But it was actually incorrect. It was all about generating sales and revenue and building up an industry.
mm,
So the whole world was fighting for something that didn't really need to be fought for, but we never could understand because we didn't go through the facts and try to get the facts because the facts weren't there. So this happens so prevalently, like throughout the market everywhere. So it happens in individuals, it happens in business, it happens in corporate, it happens everywhere where we try to push our own envelope by sharing anecdotal information that doesn't really align to something. So how do we better educate people to do their research so that they're not fighting a battle that's incorrect or fighting for a cause that has been muddied by corporations or generating sales? And then how do we take that down to the people side where people can start to be questioning what's going on and not taking offense, which means that you have to go one layer deeper, which is how do I
mm.
teach people to take information? And I think the loss in communication is that I'm easy to output, but I'm not very good at taking information in. How do I better
Yeah.
receive this information and allow myself a few minutes to breathe, think about it, and have a rebuttal or
Mm,
regroup another time? Because I think the loss
mm,
here is that we're all good at spouting, but we're all very weak at receiving that information. And how do I do something with this information and not take offense because it's not offensive, it's information? And then how do I
yeah.
triangulate this into something better to move forward with so that we all can grow and move on? And we all will grow if, like you said, you talked about this earlier. I talk to the people that aren't talking in the room. How do I get those people to share? And when I do, they have nuggets of great information. Well, that's the same thing,
Yeah.
is that you've brought them to receive. They've been receiving it. They listen the whole time. And now they're being able to translate that and triangulate back to giving out great insight to the rest of the meeting. So how do you go about doing that?
Man, that's a lot to unpack. Um, a miracle? I don't know. I I would start with it takes practice. right? I I think most people aren't taught to listen. And when we're having a conversation, most people are in that mode of like, I need to respond to this, versus actually like actively listening and letting that information process. Um, you know, Going back to things that my dad taught me, it's like not everything needs a response, and then I would add to that, not everything needs a response right away. Sometimes it's actually best to take a step back, and assess the information that you've just been given. Because when people are talking, you're listening. It's just data, right? And you have to be able to process that data in a way where is this acrimonious? Are what they're saying actually true? Like, is this a personal attack? I think there's just a series of questions that you have to go through, right? But ultimately, for me, it's like it's practice in having that awareness, which is difficult. Because to your point, when you started your rebuttal was like, we have to go back to our childhoods, and that's one of the things that should be taught is like actually actual communication. So I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer outside of like building awareness, building some education mechanisms, um, and urging people to do their research, because to your point, there is a lot of misinformation out there, and then also information that is geared towards pushing us in one direction or another, and having the ability to question that and critically think through it is going to help us communicate with each other better, and not be reactive to the things that we're hearing from people, and the conversations that we have, and the things that we see on TV, and you name it. Um, so yeah, I wish I could say there was an easy and short solution, but I don't think there is.
Well, I think that's
We just have to keep fighting the battle.
no, totally agree. I think that's a great way of sharing it, and the fact that you're taking it in, you're letting yourself think about it, and I think it's that receiving the information and understanding what can I do with this. And to your
Mm,
point earlier is that once you start to understand what you bring and what you can share in this conversation, or what you can bring to the conversation, is that as this process is going forward, yeah, you're going to have incorrect information, learning all these things, but it's also about controlling your emotion. So how do I control that
hmm
emotion? And I would share to people, treat it like you're at the office. Someone just
hmm
shared something with you. Do you snap on them, right on the blackboard and tell them off? No, you take a second, you think about it, you articulate yourself either on your notes, or you say, I'm going to get back to you. And you make that an objective to
mm,
get back to them. You write it down in your book, your calendar, and you literally get back to them on an answer for that system, because all those people are now accounting to you. So I know this sounds
hmm
processed, but until you become good at it, you have to process it.
yeah,
So take your
yeah,
time, figure it out, and come back. But make sure you come back, because if you don't come back, then you just literally let something that was maybe of importance fall away because you didn't want your emotion to get into it. Emotion can come into something, but let yourself
hmm
articulate it in a more calm fashion, and you'll get further along with all your communication. But to your point, I think communication is paramount to everything in life. And I think that there's times for emotion, there's times for not, and there's time for articulating and all these things. And they come with experience, but they also come with questioning, learning, and all of those great
yeah,
skills. So maybe we just all need to take a pause so that we can start to learn together how to communicate, so that in the next 10 to 15 years, if we start today, we'll all be that much better at it. And then no one will get offended when you tell them whatever that might be that could be hurtful. They'll take it as a way that you're trying
mm,
to help, instead of taking it as insulting, right?
yeah. 100%. And I think a good kind of tagline is the power of the pause to process.
I love that. Think twice, speak once.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're almost here. We're been great conversation, so we're gonna get really close here to the end. So we're gonna jump into some rapid fire questions and pick one or the other from your investor
Shoot.
standpoint.
Yeah.
All right. Rapid fire. Let's do this. Would you invest in a founder or co-founder?
Founder.
Unicorn or a 4-year 10x exit?
Give me a 4-year 10x exit.
In AI or blockchain?
AI.
First money in or Series A?
First money in.
Board seat or observer?
Board seat.
Safe or convertible note?
Safe.
Lead or follow?
Follow.
Favorite part of investing?
Founders.
Number of companies invested per year?
I typically do 4 to 6.
Love it. Verticals of focus?
Fintech, education, and healthcare under the umbrella of quality of ordinary life.
2 qualities for a startup to stand out to you.
The problem they're solving and the people involved.
Do you have a philosophy or any rules that you stand behind?
Get to know the team that you're investing in really well. Understand their problem and how, by solving that problem, the potential to change the world.
Perfect. What piece of advice would you give founders 9 out of 10 times?
Just build and sell.
Build and sell. I love that. Who is your hero, mentor, and why?
It's easy. My dad. He's taught me so many things that I at some point would love to write a book about. But just in innumerable and invaluable advice ever since I was a kid. Even though many aspects of it I didn't understand until I got older.
Fair. I think those come in time.
Yeah.
What tech do you think will define the world in the next 5 years?
That's easy. I mean, I think everyone's gonna say AI, and I think they're right. I mean, it bleeds into everything, every industry that we're doing.
What is your favorite investment you've made?
Um, Probably the most recent one because of the founder's patience and ability to take feedback. It's a company called Veli, and they're building in the blockchain crypto space. But it took me 18 months to come to the decision on them because I didn't initially like their idea, but they kept following up, kept updating me, kept asking questions, which I really appreciate of founders. And when they started getting some traction, that's when it became attractive for me. And they didn't give up. It's because it's the numbers tell you very starkly that most startups fail early on in the process, and it takes, I think, a certain amount of grit, perseverance to be able to keep going despite all the odds stacked against you.
I love it. Toughest lesson you've learned as an investor?
Due diligence on the co-founder.
All right.
Yeah. Don't just fall in love with the founder. You have to do your diligence on the co-founder as well.
Fair. Yes, I agree with that on everybody, everything that's going on. Fast moving ship.
Absolutely.
Favorite movie and what character? We're going to move the personal segment, which we've shortened. So for this case, it's shortened to 3 powerful questions. Okay. What is your favorite movie, and what character would you play?
Favorite movie is Forrest Gump, and the character I would play in there, not actually, Tom Hanks' character. It's Lieutenant Dan.
Lieutenant Dan.
Lieutenant Dan. Yeah.
I'm gonna watch that movie again tonight because I haven't seen it in so long. I can't remember every single piece about it, but I'm gonna dive into that.
Oh, it's such a great movie. Yeah.
All right, favorite book.
Favorite book. It's A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. It was a nonfiction piece that he wrote, and it wasn't released until after his death. And I found it. I used to love, when I had time, going to old used bookstores and literally would spend hours there. Like, I just love the smell of old books, and was in the fiction section because I was a huge Hemingway fan. One of a gift that I got for my birthday, probably one of my favorite gifts ever, was my second, third grade teacher. She knew I was a big Hemingway fan, so one of my birthdays, she got a the same typewriter that he used to write Old Man in the Sea. Got it restored, and that was like my birthday gift. I still have it. And but the book is fascinating in the sense that it's about his formative years as a writer in Paris in the 20s and 30s, and it's just the you know adventures and the transition that he went through as a writer.
I love it. I actually just read that book again. Like
Really?
literally, yeah, like probably finished it maybe 2 months ago. So yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it's good.
Love it.
Honestly, well, of course it's good. It's a
Yeah.
good book. Um, yeah, yeah, we have uh, so many. There were some other things I was going to pop in. You shared when you were 2 years old. You wrote a book, or grade two.
Yes.
I wrote a book in grade
Yeah.
two as well, and I was trying to remember what it was about. So while we were talking, my brain was like, "What was the book you wrote?" And it was because we used to read choose your own ending stories, those books where you got to
Okay.
choose where you're going.
Yeah.
So the book was made
Yeah.
the same way. I wrote it like that. And because I was Hardy Boys, you remember the Hardy Boys? I used to read the
Mm-hmm.
Hardy Boys, and there was another one, the choose your own ending with those. So it was a combination of the Hardy
Yeah.
Boys and choose your own ending story kind of combined together. So that was what I did in my grade two. So yeah, so
Oh,
I'm
I
a
love
big
it.
fan.
I my mine was about penguins. So we our class had just read Mr. Popper's Penguins, and I was influenced and motivated to write a competing book. So I wrote a book called Penguin City, and I was I can't draw to save my life. It's just not a talent that I have. And but the girl that was sitting next to me in class, she was a great artist. So after I wrote the book, I went to her. I said, "Hey, I have a proposition for you." She's like, "Okay, what?" It's like, "Well, I wrote a book." She's like, "You did what?" It's like, "I wrote a book." She's like, "All right." I was like, "But I can't draw. Can you illustrate it?" And she's just like, "Can I read it first?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course. Take it home. No rush. Take your time." Came back the next day. She's like, "This is cool. I'll illustrate your book." So I was brokering deals, in second grade.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. Best story. I love that. So you're already hustling and working out book deals in grade two. So that's brilliant. I love it.
Always.
I love it. All right, last question,
Yeah.
man. What is your superpower?
Mm. Learning. I will say learning. You know, I've when I go do talks and go to events, whether it's an event or just like a more intimate group, one of the questions I often get is like how I've been able to do everything that I've done, and I go back to my ability to just learn, and my dedication to learning and betting on myself that go back to the story about Octane where they're like, oh yeah, like we need you to build customer success. I'm like, I've never done it. I'm like, but I figured it out, and we built a really great team. And the 18 months that I was there, we never missed goal. And that's it. You just have to keep trusting yourself to and betting on yourself to learn. Um, And I think that will lead you to amazing places.
Yeah, I love that bet on yourself. It's strong. I also believe that you're very engaging. You're good at getting people to communally come together. So I think that's pretty huge. It's another great asset that you have, of course. So I love it. It's a great superpower. So I want to say it was fantastic getting the opportunity to chat with you today. KO, it was a lot of learning, a lot of notes, and we may have broke the barrier on the longest podcast. We didn't break the longest 60-second spot, but we certainly did break the other ones. But I'm going to say it was a real pleasure getting to chat with you today and learn more about you. And hopefully the audience gets just as excited as I have. And I want to appreciate all your time. And the way we like to end our show is we want to give you the last word. So anything that you want to share with the investors or the startup community, I turn it over to you, and please share how people can find you as well. But thank you.
Yeah. No. Well, I'll start with thank you, man. It's really great to reconnect with you after so many months. I think it was January that we met, and there's been a bunch of things that have happened between then. But yeah, really, really great to be able to jump on your podcast and share my story, and also hear more of your thoughts. And I really appreciate the questions. Um, in terms of the last word with investors and founders, it's really, for me, going back to my rant about communicating, uh, being transparent with what you're doing, and not being afraid to reach out and connect, whether it's with other founders or investors, because that's the other thing that I found really valuable in my life, is just building that network. And the worst anyone can say to you is no. Whether you're a founder that's looking to raise money from an investor, or if you're an investor looking to raise money from an LP, um, if you really believe in the work that you're doing and the impact that you're seeking, um, just got to keep going.
I love it.
Yeah.
You're a good man. Thank you very much. Stay amazing. And thank you for sharing today.
Yeah, thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Okay, that was a great conversation with Keo. We actually literally just spent the last 2 hours going in and outside the podcast with lots of great conversation and talking about a lot of cool things, which I obviously am big fan of what Keo's done and all the information he shared. And a couple of things that we'll talk better, or talk to, I guess, and share is keep in mind how to communicate better. He really emphasized the whole communication in his 60-second rant. And, some of the things you could tie into that is, conflict is good, not creating it, but working through conflict, which goes back to how you communicate and how you receive information, and then how you pass that information back. Everything is about learning. So we should be able to share all of our thoughts and feelings throughout anything that we do, especially in personal and in business. Being transparent. I think a lot of things he talked about when working with founders, the key is to be transparent. It's learning, and that goes back to the communication side, sharing all that great information that's going to help people. When working with large teams or building your teams, it's setting clear expectations, KPIs, things that we can all try to achieve and what we can grow towards. And then, of course, some of the things that about these systems and the teams that he was building, and how he interviewed and how he was able to build teams up to 150, 200 people, and, building that culture, and how he interviewed, and, what scares you to be here, or what things are you feeling challenged, why do you want to do this? The Forrest Gump movie thing, which I really liked, the quirky question, just to find out the way people think. And then I guess I'll leave it at the three things that I would always ask anybody, or share to anybody, that any engagement, from meetings to personal to anything, what will I learn? Who will I meet? And what will I be paid? And you pick which one means the most to you at the time, and what the one's going to bring the most value out. And I think from Keo's standpoint, it's adding in, can I affect a community, and who's going to benefit from this? engagement. So I think you can start to make this about 5 things and really add that in. I think that's awesome. So really great sharing that Keo brought to us today, and hopefully everybody learned a lot of great things. So thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to share with your friends, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and or please follow us on Spotify, Amazon, or Apple. You can find us on all social platforms, including LinkedIn at Supporters Fund. Your support and comments are truly appreciated. Please visit us at supportersfund.com and our startup events at openpeoplenetwork.com. Thank you and have a fantastic day.